Rambam in his Igeret Teiman, most of what I'm going to say today revolves around what the Rambam writes in Igeret Teiman. He says that the Jewish people have dealt with missionaries, whether it was before the Christianity and Islam or after, that the Jewish people are in a constant attack by those who want us to cease to believe, to follow in what the Torah says. So as Rabbi Klein mentioned, I was on a university campus for a very long time. I studied at very good universities. I was blessed. And spent some time at Berkeley, at UCLA, at NYU. And then they put me on the faculty, gave me a position, and I taught comparative religions, which is to teach all the religions that you could think of, whether new religions, cults, Buddhism, Hinduism, Taoism, which all these religions, we might think they're not very important, but I was lucky to have a meeting. It lasted a couple of hours. Rav Moshe Shapira Zatzal. And we went through each religion one by one, through what are the issues in each one in terms of Judaism. And so it's an aspect that we have to think about, not only Christianity and Islam, although those are the greatest dangers for the Jewish people, but there are lots of many different religions and movements that are vying for neshamas on college campuses. And it's important to note, and maybe it's something that is not so evident, but for me it's very evident. It's not only that we have to deal with religious missionaries, but we have to deal with what I call secular missionaries. The educational system that many have to deal with, at least in the ones that I'm very familiar with in the United States. I know that my colleagues in the university were very much into missionizing, into their own worldviews, and even though they had what I would consider not very good evidence to argue for them. So the Rambam in Igeret Teiman gives us, if you look at just the structure of what he wrote, I think he gives us a table or a tablet how to deal with missionaries. How can we help as Mekarvim, as those who know how to provide answers to Jews who are under these type of attacks or threats, which they might not see them as a threat at all. So the Rambam begins by explaining to his readers how the size of the danger and the severity of the challenge of missionizing. He is talking about, because of whatever is happening in that historical period, that the Jews of Yemen are being forcibly converted into Islam, and that those who are able to get away and are not forcibly converted, they have questions with regard to Islam in the way that it's being presented. And so the real challenge is about Islam. But the Rambam brings sources from the Nevi'im, from the Torah, to show that this was a very, very serious danger from the founding of the Jewish people. And he says that one of the things that we have to deal with is recognize that we have a level of ignorance among the Jewish public that is contributing to the success or to the attack by the missionaries. That is, if the Jewish people really knew Torah well, they knew Nach well, they knew Chazal well, there would be no issue. But the problem is that in Golus, the ability to learn Torah was minimized. And it's so difficult that the majority of the Yidden in the world at that time didn't know enough to be able to defend themselves against the attacks. So that's what he says. And then the third stage in the book is he tells the reader, and which is very important for us to know, that the prophets warned us about this. This is not something new that only the Jews living in 21st century in America or even in Israel. I don't know if you've been following the news. There are several groups in Israel, particularly the Jews for Jesus, that are very active in Ashdod, in Rehovot, in cities around. I don't know so much in Yerushalayim. I don't live in Yerushalayim. But I know that around where I live, which is Rehovot, they're very, very active by putting CDs in people's mailboxes. And they particularly target Haredi neighborhoods. We can talk about that a little bit later, why. The Rambam says that the motivation of all missionaries, whether they were Syrian, it is before Christianity, whether they were the Greeks, whether they are Muslims, whether they are Christians, whoever they are simply interested, lachlok al Hashem. Their motivation is to move us away from Hashem because it is a battle for fighting against Hashem, which is almost going back to the time of Avraham Avinu. That Avraham Avinu was one side of the world and the entire world was on the other side. And that's how the Rambam frames the danger. The dangerous aspect is because it's really about trying to get the Jews to stop believing in Hashem. It's a form of rebellion to Hashem. And for us as Mekarvim, we have to understand where they're coming from. They might seem very nice, they might seem very pleasant and willing to have discussions, but we have to really understand where they're coming from and what is the source that is motivating them. Then the Rambam explains a very, very important principle that I think not a lot of us think about. He says that the major difference between Judaism and all other religions is the difference between a human being and a statue. What does that mean? It means that the Kadosh Baruch Hu gave human beings the ability, rightly or wrongly, to create their own religions. We have an ability to create religion. We do. And we find that new religions are constantly being created. Sometimes we call them cults. They're more successful, less successful. But there are offshoots and new developments all the time. There is a whole field in religious studies called new religions. And I remember that when at least I was teaching in Nebraska at the time, and it was right after David Koresh in Texas. And everybody wanted to get a hold of his writings to see what is this new religion saying. And that human beings have this ability to create a new religion. In the same way that human beings have the ability to create a statue. But although on the outside it looks the same, but on the inside they have nothing in common. And that's really the difference between Judaism and all other religions. And in that sense, when you have an opportunity to speak to a young man or a woman who is being pulled to different directions by missionaries, you have to be aware of what's happening. There is a man-made religion with internal conflicts that are going to be fairly easy to discover, to Judaism, a religion that we've received from the Kadosh Baruch Hu directly. What I noticed personally, and we can get into some stories that I've had with missionaries or with also Jews who converted to Christianity particularly. What happens is that other religions take Jewish terms and give them a different meaning. And now if you combine that with the ignorance of Jews around the world, it becomes a very, very dangerous situation. So the simplest example is the way that Messiah is being used in Christianity and how it's used in Judaism. They say, well, no, we believe in the same thing. But they have a very, very different understanding of what the concept of Messiah is in Judaism. And they will try to point out that, you see, this is the true meaning and you should follow what we say. The Rambam ends throughout the Igeret Teiman in his writing, when he wants to talk about the word Torah, when he writes in Arabic, he doesn't use the word Torah. He uses the word Sharia. Every single time he says Sharia, 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 Sharia. Why? He could say halacha. He's writing to other Jews that for sure know the word halacha or Torah. But he says the word Sharia because he believes that they took an Arabic word and gave it a different meaning. And the battle is about those terms. It's about reappropriating the terms back to what the meaning is given in the Torah. And by doing that, by telling, when Jews now are being forced to convert to Islam, and they're saying, this is Sharia, he says, no, you want to know what Sharia is? This is Sharia. At the end of Igeret Teiman, the Rambam writes to the people that he sent the letter to, he says to them that to please keep this letter from falling to the wrong hands, because it would put his life in danger. Obviously, he's living in Egypt, right, in the 12th century. The Rambam died 1204. So he is afraid that this would fall into the wrong hands, and if Muslims read what he wrote, it would be very, very dangerous for him. So he says, at the end he says, but I'm not afraid to write this, because, and then he says a very, very strange term. He says, because the Khalifat Allah, which is the vice-regents of God, promised me the Shaliach Mitzvah Ino Nizok. Now, in Islam, Khalifat Allah is the name for the Caliph. This is where the English word Caliph comes from. It means the substitute for God on earth. And literally, it's supposed to be the substitute or the follower of the messenger of God, which was Muhammad. But the Rambam is saying, no, the true vice-regents of the Kadosh Baruch of God in this world are Chazal. It's not what they said. That is, they are taking a term from Judaism and are misappropriating it and referring it to whatever they want. But he says, no, the real, in Arabic he's saying this, that the vice-regent, those who speak for Hashem on earth are Chazal. And if Chazal promised me that I will be okay by writing this, then that's why I sent it. So I have to do ishtadlus to tell you to make sure that it doesn't fall in the wrong hands. But Chazal are the ultimate vice-regent, Khalifat Allah. And so you'll see that all religions, and particularly Christianity, misappropriate Jewish terms and use them in a different way than it is. The best way of avoiding getting into psukim, verses, what does this mean, what does this mean, what does this mean, is what the Rambam says. He says, the Rambam says, emphasize that the Torah doesn't change. Stick to that. The Torah doesn't change. And keep referring to the event of Har Sinai. I was taking a cab in Haifa. I was speaking at the Haifa University, and the cab driver was listening to Quranic verses. So I made a mistake, and I told him which surah that was in the Quran. And he looked at me, and he said, so did you study Quran? I said, yes, I had to study Quran because I studied Arabic. So he said to me, why aren't you a Muslim? So I didn't want to say, well, because I read the Quran, because that wasn't going to get into an argument with him. What I said was the following. I said, look, you've heard that Moshe Rabbeinu was a Navi. He says, of course, he's a prophet, big prophet. And he told us that anybody who tells us that to change anything from what he said, not to believe him. And I said, now comes your prophet, and he says to change what the Torah says. But Moshe Rabbeinu told us not to stray from this. Anybody who's going to tell you anything different, not to listen to him. And I said to him, now if anybody who would tell you to stray from what Muhammad told you, then you would certainly not agree with it. They say, of course not, you can't. So he says, yeah, I agree with you. So I said, that's the reason. That if you want to tell me, for me to accept your religion, then the Rambam says, he brings a medrash, he said, the Rambam says, tell him to recreate Har Sinai. Bring all the Jewish people back to Har Sinai, have Ma'amad Har Sinai all over again, and then have Hashem reveal 2.0. But as long as there's no 2.0, we're sticking with 1.0, because that's what the Kadosh Baruch Hu said. And so it's really, you avoid dealing with all of the other psukim of Isaiah. If you're dealing with Christians with Isaiah, with Jeremiah, listen, does the Torah change? If they say it changes, then it's done. It's over. Because they're not going to be able to show you anywhere in the Torah that it says that it's going to change. Both Islam and Christianity claim that Judaism is obsolete. They both do. Islam is a bit more severe because they argue that the Jews falsified the Torah. That is, whatever we received from God was changed, and what we have now is something as a falsification. It's not true, so therefore they can just be mevatel it with their hand. And the Rambam says that the Torah itself rejects this. Anyone who says that the Torah must change is out. So as long as you keep the discussion on the Chumash, on the Torah, you don't have to get into all of the other subjects that they want to pull you to argue about. The next stage in the template that the Rambam gives us is to strengthen the person who is under this situation, who found himself being missionized. And the Rambam does this to the Jews of Yemen, to strengthen them, to be mechazik them, to give them, to tell them what they're doing right, to tell them that this is not easy, that this is very difficult. And by doing that, you keep the door open for dialogue. And the person you understand, at least you might not be able to understand on the same level, but that there's a real tug and war for this person between what you're trying to tell him and what this missionary is trying to tell him. And by acknowledging that there is real conflict, there is a real pull, it gives you, at least that's how I understand the Rambam, it gives you an opportunity to save this Jew from being pulled away. Now, the next thing I'm going to say, the Rambam doesn't say it. And the Rambam actually does just the opposite. But I don't think that in our generations we could do this. We shouldn't disparage the missionaries or what they're presenting. What we find that in Kiruv, that students are very, very sensitive to any sort of negative comments that we might make about what they're dealing with. And so putting down the other religions, or the person, the pastor, the minister, the imam, whoever it is going to create an issue for us. And so what we have to do is make sure that we reinforce what Judaism says, but we don't put the other religions down, because then immediately they feel attacked. And we're going to have to backpedal. The fourth, which is, I tell this all the time, and it sounds cliche, but it's very, very important. Don't be a hero. That is to say, you have to be aware whether you have the kelim, you have the tools to get into this, of what the missionaries are saying, how to respond. If you do not, then don't get into it. There are plenty of sources, get help. There are plenty of sources in both online, in Ohr Somayach, around everywhere. There are people who are experts on how to deal with them. And the expertise doesn't only lie in verses and psukim, but also the psychological game that is happening while the missionary does his work. Everybody knows that Kiruv works through relationships. So what you have to understand if you're going to try to help this young Jew is to try to understand what's attractive. What is being presented that is so attractive to this person? And although that's my expertise, but it's usually not about theology. It's not, unfortunately, most people are not great theologians, and they're not being drawn from one theological position to another by sheer argumentation and logic. That's not what's happening. It's something social, something experiential. There's something exciting about something new. So you have to try to figure out what is the context in which this is happening. And strengthen your relationship with the student. Don't see this missionary as necessarily a threat. Expect that there is going to be a back and forth for the student. So once you're going to give the answers, then he's going to go back to the missionary, or usually the missionary will find the student and say, so, what did your rabbi say? And then you're going to get answers. You're going to have to understand that that is the nature of the process. You can't really tell the student, listen, just bring your guy at high noon to the clock at the university, and we're going to have that's not going to happen. Usually they're going to try to avoid it. So understand that that is going to be the dynamics, and try to figure out what is attractive to this young man or young woman about is it about being courted? Is it about being wanted and being drawn? Or is there something else? The next idea is to try to figure out the psychological state of the student. Students on college campuses are dealing with lots and lots of psychological situations, let's call it. They are many times lonely. They're away from their families, living in dorms. Sometimes they're idealistic. They might be insecure. They might not have any directions. They may have a crisis, a girlfriend or something, or parents, or money. All those sort of things are going to play a role in how effective a missionary is going to be. And when you figure this out, when you understand what's going on, it's going to help you understand what is needed in terms of establishing a very good relationship with a student. So the greatest threat, at least in the United States, is Christianity. That's for sure. They're present on virtually all college campuses. But there are others. There are Muslims who are interested in bringing Americans into Islam. There are Baha'is, which is an offshoot of Shia Islam. They have a center in Israel. It's amazing. All these religions have a center in Israel. There's no other place in the world for you than Akko. Okay. I met a Jew that was, converted to Zoroastrianism, which is a religion that, was big during the time of the Gemara, the Sasanian Empire. And I said to him, but you can't convert to Zoroastrianism. They wouldn't let you in. He says, but I'm a Zoroastrian. So there's lots and lots of religions that you're going to find out that there are Jews who are drawn to them. Buddhism is another big one on campus. It's not so much Hare Krishnas anymore, but Buddhism. People are very much interested in Buddhism. Hinduism, not so much. They get into yoga, but that's about it. But Buddhism is something that I found. There were Jews that I had to try to help them and understand the difference and why they should stay Jewish as opposed to adopt Buddhism. The last point that I want to say is that it's important to be open. Keep an open mind as you're listening to the back and forth. I usually acknowledge a good question. When I hear a good question from the other side and you tell a student, that's a really, really good question. And really good questions usually can have really good answers. And I always say that the Rishonim have already answered all these questions. If you just know the Rishonim very well, at least the history of the polemical literature, the Ramban, the Rambam, others, Rabbi Yosef Albo, those questions were already addressed. So that we have the answers, we have how to help our students get away from the missionaries. Now, I'm going to mention a few sort of techniques that obviously they're just Rashi Prakim. In order to apply them, you probably need we need more time to go through a few cases. But one of the techniques is to make sure that you use a reliable translation, the Art Scroll, or Lashon HaKodesh if you can. It's very, very important. Because the technique that is used by missionaries is to isolate and decontextualize the pasuk. They will take it out of its context and use a different interpretation that sometimes, I always tell, when I've had debates with missionaries, and I always said, listen, I have no idea, I've never heard your pasuk in my life. Let's open a Chumash, let's open, in Hebrew and Lashon HaKodesh, and most of the time that's going to solve the problem. Most of the time, because they're going to say, it says like this. It says, no, it really doesn't say that. This is what it really says. And they will be, but mine says, he said, yes, yours is a translation. It says, and you have multiple translations. Look at the whole chapter. That is, if they give you a pasuk, say, okay, look at the pasuk, but look at the whole chapter. Look at the context of what's happening. Look at the meforshim. Usually the Meforshim, the Rishonim will tell you if it's a pasuk that has the possibility of being used against us, the Meforshim will give you a clue already how to get out of it. They will tell you. I've seen this many, many times. Sometimes they use the Septuagint, and we sometimes think that, that's the Septuagint, that's the Targum Shivim, yeah, that's the one that Chazal tell us about. But you have to understand, the Targum was only done on the Chumash, and that Targum is lost. Nobody has it. What they call Septuagint is not what was done back at the time during the Chazal's time. And it's acknowledged in Christian sources. Christian sources say that what we have is the translation that we did. It has nothing to do with what the Jews did. It might be based on it. So all of the Navi and Ketuvim that they will quote and say, but the Septuagint, you have to agree with this because it was your translation. It's pure ignorance. It has nothing to do, no Jew has ever translated into Greek, as far as we know, that is at least authoritative Jew. There might have been Jews who did it, but nothing within the Masorah of Judaism that translated that is called the Septuagint. Whatever they term Septuagint, even for today, for the Chumash, it has nothing to do with any rabbis or any Jews. It's simply a Christian text with its own issues. Allegory. They many times will try to argue that a particular passage or a verse has to be taken allegorically. And for us, if you're really interested in understanding how allegory works in Judaism, Rabbi Matalon has a book called Torah, Chazal, Science, where he has a whole chapter, section dealing with allegory. And it's not so simple, because the Rishonim say that there's nothing, you cannot allegorize anything in the Chumash. It's only in the Navi. Everything in the Chumash has to be taken the way that it is. There are ways that we have to use a little bit of interpretations, but it's not allegorical. You can see that in the Rav Saadia and in the Rambam particularly. So anything that if you talk about the Torah and they want to allegorize anything, don't agree to the game. Now if it's in something in Navi, that's possible, but you have to have a Masorah for allegory. You can't just allegorize everything, because if that's what they want to do, you can just allegorize whatever they want to use as their evidence and just allegorize that, and then they'll understand that they're not going to win that way. Sometimes, and this is the last time I had a meeting with it, there was a Jewish man who converted to Christianity, became a Catholic priest. And it's an interesting story. I spent 2 hours with him, and after 2 hours he told me that now he believes that all religions are false. So I said, okay, Baruch Hashem, at least we're able to do that. Now Bezat Hashem, we'll work on the next stage. But part of the discussion with him was about Chazal. And there are missionaries who argue that Chazal are evidence for Christianity. And they will bring statements in the Gemara or in Medrash to say, you see, Chazal, they believe in Christianity. So just ask them, did Chazal, were they Christian? That was the Ramban's answer. Because when his debate in Tortosa in the 1260s was clearly about that the missionary argued that according to the Gemara, the Messiah has come. And that the Jews are simply hiding what everybody else knows. And so the Ramban asked, if you're right that Chazal say this, then why were they not Christian? And so it's always when they bring Chazal, ask them, so do you think they believed? Well, no, they didn't believe. Okay, so if they didn't believe, then obviously it has to have a different meaning.